Britain has a funny relationship to money. On the one hand, people on minimum wage or measly benefits are frequently told they just need to learn to budget.
The typical user of a food bank is not someone that's languishing in poverty, it's someone who has a cash flow problem episodically. No, it's true.
There's not this massive use for food banks in this country. We've got generation after generation who cannot cook properly, they can't cook a meal from scratch, they cannot budget, the challenge is there.
So people on low incomes don't need handouts, they just need to budget. Meanwhile, people on incomes 4 times higher than the minimum wage are convinced they don't have a mere pound to spare. This was an infamous episode of Question Time in the run-up to Britain's last general election.
I've read your policy. It's above £80,000. And I am nowhere near in the top 5%, let me tell you. I'm not even in the top 50%.
And that's why we're not going to increase your income tax. And
So hang on, let's just be clear. So you're suggesting you would raise income tax on those earning over £80,000. You're saying that would affect you because you earn over that sum?
Yes.
So you earn over £8,000?
Yes, and I'm not in the top 5%.
I think that is the top 5%, isn't it?
I'm not.
Sorry. I've seen that so many times before, but just like he's so annoyed that anyone would think he's not in the top 5%. He even thinks he's not in the top 50%. So the median annual wage in 2019 for full-time employees was 30 grand, right? And it would have been even lower if you included those working part-time. Yet that man on 80 grand thought he was in the bottom half of earners, and he was absolutely outraged and indignant when anyone suggested he wasn't. So, how do Britons get such a poor understanding of how their wages compare to others? And how do those on high salaries maintain the illusion that they are struggling compared to people on much lower incomes than themselves? Well, our politicians don't help. On Friday, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, tweeted about calls he'd had with constituents, and he ended with this anecdote. Finally, I spoke to a lady from Godalming about eligibility for the government's childcare offer, which is not available if one parent is earning over 100k. That is an issue I would really like to sort out after the next election, as I am aware that it is not a huge salary in our area if you have a mortgage to pay. Hunt was challenged about that tweet on Sky.
Do you regret tweeting that? It doesn't sound right, does it, to say £100,000 is not a huge salary?
Well, I was talking to a constituent who was pointing out to me that, what sounds like a large salary, when you have house prices averaging around £670,000 in my area, if you've got a mortgage and you've got childcare costs, it doesn't go as far as you might think. And she's right. It doesn't go as far as you might think.
Now, the median salary this year, this is both full-time and part-time workers, is £28,000, right? So half the population earn less than £28,000 a year. So if someone on 100 grand is struggling, how does Hunt think the 50% of Brits earning a quarter of that are handling the cost of living crisis? Of course, no one is forced to buy a massive house, right? It's also more expensive to be a renter than paying a mortgage in this country. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking, therefore, that Jeremy Hunt was wildly out of touch. But over on LBC, Boris Johnson's sister has done the maths. And in fact, it turns out people on 100 grand really might be struggling.
Based on a rough calculation, after that, it's about 6 grand. Minus what I've just said, you are left more or less with £2,500.
Have you taken you said council tax, have you taken into account a mortgage payment there?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I say council tax about 300, light and heat about 400, mortgage or rent about 1,800.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's
house
about right.
insurance, car insurance about 1,000. Have excluded hire purchase or
Hold
any
on.
credit card.
Car and house, sorry to be granular, but you say together car and house a month is 1,000?
No. Travelling and all that, if you've got a rail card or something like that.
Oh, I see. Okay. You said insurance. That seems very high to me.
No. I'll put insurance like £25 a month, car insurance and house insurance. I've divided it all by monthly here. So I've given you a gross figure of £1,000, including the rail card, or travelling to London if you're commuting. For my calculation, I say £2,500 a month, which is left over. Now, if you
Okay, well then divide that by 4. So what do we get a week? 600 quid a week?
About 600 a week, but I haven't included
You see,
in
that
there.
isn't very much. You are
Pardon?
absolutely right. That is not very much.
No, it is not very much. Because why? From my experience, me and my wife, we both earn this kind of money monthly.
Both
And
of
it
you
doesn't-
earn 100.
No, jointly.
Jointly,
I should
okay.
stress the point. But it doesn't get as far. I mean, we have to think about a cheap holiday rather than an extraordinary expensive holiday.
My goodness. So the cost of living crisis is very much not over.
£600 a week. That isn't very much. I can spend that quite easily in a fancy restaurant in Soho. £600. The cost of living crisis really is. I finally, people are struggling in this country. £600 a week after all of your bills and all of your essential expenditure. That's real poverty, isn't it, Ash?
I was spitting feathers, Michael, because this man said after all of his essential expenses, including food, that he had only £2,500 a month for disposable income, right? £2,500 a month disposable income. That is a lot of disposable income. That is an awful lot of disposable income. That's quite a lot to save. That's quite a lot for, what you might consider, luxury purchases, leisure activities, saving up for a holiday, especially if you've already factored in your housing costs, paying off a mortgage, which is itself an asset, which, is going to appreciate in value. Like, I'm sorry, these people are deluded. And I don't like dunking on, people who phone up, radio shows because it's a bit like sneering at the public. The job of a journalist is to sort of introduce context which can put whatever someone is saying in perspective. The problem is that you've got a media class who are all objectively wealthy people with secure jobs, high status. And, Rachel Johnson comes from a rich family and they themselves have the self-perception of being hard done by. They don't think they're very rich because they're not the super rich. So if they're in the top 5, 4, maybe 3% of earners, they still feel like, oh, well, I don't get to go in a private jet. So, I'm just getting by, really. You've got these people who are shaping the public discussion. So you have a completely bananas approach to thinking about personal finances and what people need. You end up with this sense of, okay, someone who is on 80K plus is just getting by versus someone who's on benefits but has the temerity to own a smartphone is living like Rupert Murdoch. I think that this is a sort of dysfunctional narrative, which only makes sense when you look at the class composition of senior media people.
The thing I also liked about it, because I've got no idea what Rachel Johnson's journalistic background is, but sort of the way she she had her reporter's pen out and she was sort of like, okay, so £100 for insurance. I'm just trying to be very granular here. I'm going to do this very properly. And then she concludes £600 a week. Oh my God, how can anyone possibly survive on that? This is a very important piece of journalism I've done. Thank God I am so diligent in my role. I've written it all down. And yes, it turns out that £100,000 a year is very difficult to live on. As Ash says, the attitude is very, very different when you're talking about someone on minimum wage or someone who's on tax credits who's struggling to get by on 20 grand a year, right? It's very easy to get by on 20 grand a year. Just cook meals for 30p. That's the Lee Anderson line. But then when it comes to someone who I suppose, Rachel Johnson was thinking of that person on the call a bit like herself. And when she was saying that, she was essentially saying, oh, £600 a week. I'd struggle on that because she expects to have a different lifestyle to the vast, vast, vast majority of the country.